When speaking of the invalidity of the number 0, one ought first to define what exactly it is that number is before engaging in the critique of a certain definition or attribute of a certain predicated ontology regarding numerical value. Number, or numerical values, should be simply defined as quantitative determination. That is to say, it is that which is the expression of quantitative expression, or the expression of amounts and aggregates. However, this expression of number is not merely limited to actualization or particularization of numbers in extension. It is also the expression of the essence of quantity in the abstract, not merely as a notion or concept of number, but as a real metaphysical essence and ontology. Therefore, one ought to make three distinctions when considering numbers, those being the physical, the metaphysical, and the epistemological or symbolic/notional. The first, physical, would be the actualization of a number in extension, which can better be understood as particularization, as extension or quote-unquote matter, when expressing essences can only be doing so in a particular form, as the nature of such a thing is to be imprinted upon by essence, which is proper to actuality itself. The metaphysical distinction here is what is alluded to above, in that the metaphysical category of number is that category which we call the essence of number, which transcends all particularization and is the very basis or ontological precondition for the possibility of the particularization or numerical expressed in extension. Thirdly and finally, the last aspect of number is that aspect proper to subjective understanding of number, which is to say the way in which man understands and grasps the existence of number, which is via the process of symbolic formation. Causally speaking, and I here must note cause is distinct from epistemic justification whilst still related, man experiences number in his perception of aggregates and amounts in extension. From there he understands conceptually that there is something which transcends all particularization of number, and this quote-unquote something is not just a concept, as it must be a real objective ontology, as what it is relating to is a real objective ontology. Therefore, a higher ontology must unite these qualities that these numerical extensions have, and thus we come to the conclusion of the essence of number, which transcends all particularizations of number in extension, and thus we apply a symbol to this essence to help us better understand its role as the basis and precondition for particularization. 1, 2, and 3 are the essential metaphysical symbols and epistemic of number, and 1, 2, and 3, apples, for instance, are the particularization of the essential or metaphysical category of number in extension. We cannot have three apples if we first do not have the metaphysical three which allows for the particular to exist. In other words, in order for B to exist, A must exist, therefore A is prior to the existence of B in a logical order, and necessarily so. Our symbol of number allows us to understand the distinction not only between the particular and the universal or essential, but also of the distinction between the numbers themselves, as 1, 2, and 3 are all distinct in essence and thus will be distinct in particularization. However, what makes 1, 2, and 3 distinct are all distinct is impossible to define without relating them to each other. For example, 3 is 1 more than 2, and 2 is 1 more than 1, and 1 is being itself. However, all numbers must have in common one attribute besides quantity, and that is the attribute of existence, or being, or else we could not relate them to extension, and we could not relate them in essence between themselves, as essence itself is a real category. Finally, we cannot conclude that number and its symbol, all being the expression of the essence of quantity, share being. We can conclude, rather, that number and symbol, all being the expression of the essence of quantity, share being. The very notions of quote-unquote expression, essence, and quantity presuppose being, or existence. As if this was not the case, they cannot be notions, as notions do exist as well, because the categories they reflect exist, and the notions themselves as having the identity of a notion thus exist in its identity as such, as a notion. 0 is an invalid notion of number. Considering that number is defined as the essence of quantitative determination in the sense that it precedes its particularization in extension as the essence of quantitative determination, thus sharing the category of existence in both essence and extension, one cannot say that 0 as a number is a valid concept in either essence or extension, the two domains of numerical existence. 0 is defined as the absolute lack of quantity, and often just as much is called quote-unquote nothing. And thus, if the essence of number is quantitative determination, then we cannot have an ontology which does not conform to its own nature or essence. This would be a violation of the principle of the logical law of identity and the law of non-contradiction at the same time, violating the former in that you are stripping the essence of number, which is quantitative determination, of its very quantitative determination, which it is its identity. And if 0 is a lack of quantity, you have just prescribed to an identity that its identity and its lack of identity are the same thing, which is saying, for instance here, that it is a quantity by identity and not one by identity, which is a contradiction, and also a violation, once again, of the law of identity. Thus, we also lead to a violation of the law of non-contradiction, like I had just mentioned previously, in that one is saying something exists and does not exist at the same time. One cannot get around this either by saying that 0 corresponds to the lack of particularization of the essence of number, but 0 has existence in the essential or Platonic form of number. The reason being that it cannot be the essence of something if what one is predicating as something is ultimately quote-unquote nothing. And essences are a thing and have being, while 0 is said to be non-being, which is not a thing by definition. Since it is the case that number by definition, and analytically speaking, is a thing, it cannot be said that it is not a thing at the same time. Or some notion of number which is merely an empty and meaningless notion cannot be said to have meaning if it does not have any content to it. 0 has been defined as something which rejects itself, because if it were to accept itself, it would be a thing and not a quote-unquote no thing. As you cannot postulate that which is void of all existence as postulation of anything, including number, which presupposes existence of that which it is postulating. 0 is said to have no existence, while saying it has existence vis-a-vis a contradiction. Thus, 0 as the concept of number is invalid. Therefore, a correspondence of an invalid concept to reality cannot be said to be true by virtue of it being invalid and incoherent. I encourage those who postulate the notion of 0 as valid to tell us how you do not see yourself going in circles telling the world that nothing is something, and vice versa. Whilst this clearly is a contradiction, there is no way out of this dilemma, and any attempt at a refutation of my argument must prove the law of non-contradiction to be false, a task impossible, as in the very attempt to disprove the law of non-contradiction you presuppose its validity. For that you are saying your notion is correct opposed to another notion which assumes the other cannot be correct, and you yourself are correct, for every postulation can be negated, but not at the same time it is in its truth. When one says, quote unquote, the law of non-contradiction is false, it assumes in its predication that it is false and not true. And if one were to deny this, then they'd have to deny that there is not a difference between their argument and its refutation. So they would have no basis to deny the law of non-contradiction if they have no argument by their own admission. If their argument has its own identity, which can be contradicted, it no longer has its identity as that argument or any identity at all. They then have no argument, and the dialectic of discourse has closed itself. All things considered, there are still valid concerns that one may have, and they will be addressed here from here on, namely on the use of symbolism and operational potency. However, one final remark shall be made. The issue of 0 as a notion is that in your act of affirming the notion, you are seeking to deny the attribute which gives the notion its identity, which is the attribute of existence. And existence is that which is the ultimate attribute of that which is true. As to say something is true is no different than to say it has existence of some sort. Refutations, reinterpretations, and further considerations. 0 as a symbol and its new definition. Often it is stated that 0 is but a symbol of quote-unquote nothingness, and that 0 therefore as a symbol is entirely valid. However, this too is but another absurdity, because a symbol is a referential object, or object of relation. That is to say, the operation of a symbol is that object which references another object to convey its meaning without being the object itself. In other words, the operation of a symbol is to point towards something, and something is not quote-unquote nothing. The incoherency occurs now once we understand the role of a symbol as something which points to another, and in fact the symbol which points to quote-unquote nothing is not a symbol at all, as the very essence of a symbol is to point to something and not nothing, whatever it may be. Symbols are relational objects, and in order for them to have their existence as a symbol, it must be relating to something else, epistemologically speaking. And if that symbol lacks any object to relate toward it, it cannot be a symbol, as it is missing its necessary counterpart in an epistemic sense, and can no longer embody its essence as a symbol. Symbols, being a linguistic phenomenon, are in essence a epistemological object, and therefore require this sort of duality of its reference and itself. However, a new definition of zero can be postulated, but not as a number, but as a symbol regarding the indefinite decrease of number in a positive numerical sense, where the value of a number indefinitely decreases without touching negative integers or fractions. The symbol zero would be the opposite of the symbol for the indefinite increase, which would be known as the infinity symbol, because zero is half of the infinity symbol geometrically speaking. Thus, being half, which is less, is now its representative for the decreasing nature of which is concerned with the lessening of the value of integers and fractions. Inevitably, when speaking of the problem of numerical increase, the decrease, the issue of negative numbers arises, and this as well must be reinterpreted, as its current understanding is deeply flawed. The negative number as being that which is less than zero, or nothing, is absurd, as you cannot be less than that which does not exist. Considering also that number being the essential aspect of all quantitative instances of number, that negative number cannot exist in the form of a particular instantiation of number. For example, one cannot have negative 3 chairs, as this would mean one has 3 chairs and does not have 3 chairs at the same time, violating the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity. However, negative numbers do indeed still have their place, but in a domain of numbers not mentioned hitherto, that being direction. There can be a negative number in the sense that it is moving away from an established point, which is the positive number, and this, of course, can only be in relation to extension or space, since direction is proper to this domain of existence. Zero as relation and negativity. A common refutation of the critique of zero is that within this critique sits a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of zero, that role being negation. This critique states essentially that zero is merely a symbol of the negation or sublation of quantity. However, this is not correct. The negation of quantity is a relational phenomena, whereas the notion of zero posits a phenomenon that stands on its own in a somewhat atomized sense, somewhat because all notions are never entirely epistemologically atomized and are theory-laden. Zero in its essence is posited as a notion of pure nothingness, which is not a relational notion, as non-being lacks being and cannot relate to anything, as there is not anything to be related to. A question is still left here for us to answer, however, and that question being, does negativity as a notion collapse under the same issues as the notion of zero? The answer to this question is no, because negation is not the predication of pure nothingness, rather it is the predication of change from one state of affairs to another. A state of affairs is always something and not quote-unquote nothing. For instance, when a white table changes to a green table, the table in its identity of white has been negated in relation to its new identity of a green table. Even in this case, where the table itself has gone from existing to no longer existing, we are only understanding its existence as negated in relation to a new state of affairs. Where the table is no longer present, the issue of negation is no different from the Aristotelian movement of potential and act. Potential or potency being the possibility of existence, and act being actuality or concrete existence or actual existence. The movement from potential to actual is to be understood as not a temporal phenomenon, but in terms of causal power, as actuality is what gives cause to another actuality, and is dependent upon it for its existence as actuality. However, one can also understand potentiality and actuality in a dialectical sense, but not at the expense of the identity of the notion itself. In other words, we can shift our view of the notions of potency and actuality in a dialectical sense without compromising the original view of these notions in their validity. That shift being the notion of potency, potential existence of logically possible existence, there lies a form of actuality, and that it is true indeed that potency has its existence as potency, and thus since it has a form of existence, it has a form of actuality, in this relational sense. In the case of actuality, it has a form of potency in that it is in its actual existence. It could have been multiple other forms of existence, and the very fact of existing in its form of actuality is proof of this. It's also proof of the fact that it also exists in a domain of potency. If it can be actual, it can be logically possible, which is exactly what potency is. So one here, so one sees here that even in the case of terms denoting negation, it is no different than terms denoting change, and this can be viewed from multiple different perspectival settings, essentially speaking. A Hegelian understanding of the notion zero. A seemingly sophisticated critique of the rejection of zero can be leveled via the use of Hegelian dialectical logic, that being the logic used in Hegel's book, The Science of Logic, in particular on his understanding of being and quote-unquote nothingness and becoming. Hegel posits that when the act of predication of being and also that of nothing as such, we are actually predicating the very same exact thing. The reason being as follows. When one predicates being as such, he does not predicate any particular kind of being. Rather, he is predicating something which cannot be given any specific predication in its content, excluding the form of the notion, of course. That is to say, when one predicates being, one cannot make any predications about being, because to do so, any specific predication introduces particularization of a notion within the form of the notion of being. Once particularization occurs in the notion of being, we thus have a specific kind of being, and no longer what we wish to predicate, which was hitherto being as such. For example, when one states the essence of being is to be all-encompassing, one inserts a particular function of being, but not being itself, so that statement is not the description of being itself, rather the description of the operation of being. But any description of being introduces particularization of being, even the prescription of being it as such, because once you introduce that, you introduce a what it is not, which introduces a particularization and a distinction, and therefore a particularization is not being itself, since it is unparticular. Following on from this, we see why Hegel claims that nothing and being are the same thing, as both notions lack the ability to be attributed any predication or description of them. Being, for Hegel, means nothing, because there is not really anything we can say about being without sacrificing the meaning of the notion and concept of being in our very attempt to say something about it. Furthermore, quote-unquote nothing, when it is posited, is being, because both nothing and being are notions, and a notion has existence in a pure notional form, such as being and nothing, but both are all-encompassing lose their identity as all-encompassing once description is brought in. Once you say it is all-encompassing, it no longer becomes all-encompassing because there are things that are not all-encompassing. However, Hegel maintains that since nothing is a notional form, and as an active predication it cannot mean what it seeks to truly describe, and nothing as a notion has something to it, vis-a-vis being, for its notional form, but the existence of a notional form must not be confused with being as such, as a notional form itself is a particularization of being and not being as such. This is the fundamental distinction here, which no predications can be made, as well as is the case with that of nothing. Once predication is made of each concept, we are no longer speaking of that concept in its true meaning, but rather a deeply flawed one. And yes, I'm aware that because of this dilemma, my description here will somewhat violate this very rule. However, this is meant to be put in perspective, that which cannot be truly put into perspective, perfectly speaking. Now Hegel describes the synthesis of being and nothing as becoming, because becoming is the process of change, which is involved with the removing of a thing from being, and this is proper to the aspect of the notion of nothing, as it relates to becoming. The being aspect is present in that becoming is a process, and a process is a phenomenon and occurrence, which is something, and therefore has a form of being. One can very well see how this may be applied to the notion of zero as a notion, which is that of becoming, as a synthesis of being and nothing, as it has an aspect of being in its notional form and an aspect of nothing as its content. That being, the form of zero as a notion is something, but what it's expressing is nothing. This unfortunately does not resolve the issue for the Hegelian, because first and foremostly, zero is not posited as a notion denoting a process such as becoming. Zero is posited as a stasis and an unmoving and pure nothingness. Secondly, the Hegelian may try to find a way around this by saying that zero is a synthesis of being and nothing, but it is not becoming. The first issue with this is that if it is a synthesis of the two notions, how can it not result in the third notion of becoming, as it does for you elsewhere? The identity of the two concepts remain the same, and therefore the synthesis of the two concepts having each their own identical natures, which are also identical to one another, once combined must result in the concept identically that it was said to produce hitherto. For example, if 1 and 2 equals 3, it must be the case that 1 and 2 equals 3 each time. If something new is present regarding the notions of 1 and 2, then it should equal something else. But the second issue here is that, simply speaking, there can be no true synthesis of being and nothing, as being contains all things, and there is not anything that can be added to that which contains all things. What is there to even add in the first place? "Quote unquote nothing" cannot be added, as you would not actually be introducing something new to create the result of becoming. Furthermore, being and nothing are the same and are all encompassing in Hegel's logic. You cannot synthesize them, as they already exist as one, and you must have a distinction between things to add them, or conceptualize them as conjoined. If they are the same, we are not adding anything to them, due to the law of indiscernibles. Nothing will change via the synthesis of nothing and being if they are the same. You would be saying being plus being, or nothing plus nothing in both cases, if they are the same. No true synthesis has occurred. As well as if both are said to be totalizing, there cannot be anything added to that which already encompasses everything. Thus, we see the Hegelian cannot get around the dilemma of zero. Zero and its use in operations. It is remarked that zero serves as a function in operations, and that it is used as a numerical placeholder in larger quantities of number. For example, 100. And from this fact alone, it can be said zero as a concept is saved. Likewise, in the craft of computer programming, the binary use of ones and zeros is often used as a retort against the rejection of zero as well. This being understood, a few things must be remarked when responding to such refutations of the critique of the notional zero. That being, firstly, just because the notion of zero is used in a certain way by mathematicians and programmers does not mean the way in which they use these things is appropriate and consistent with their prior understanding and definition of the notion. Thus, when one defines zero as quote-unquote pure nothing and then says zero serves as a placeholder or component in a binary code, they sacrifice their use of the first definition as the notion of quote-unquote nothing. An operation is that which serves a function or purpose in a given system, and that which serves a function is something and not quote-unquote nothing by its very definition. If one were to concede an operation is quote-unquote nothing, then their argument would also be meaningless, as it seeks to prove the use of zero whilst denying it has use, as it is just a, once again, quote-unquote pure nothing, which cannot fulfill any function. When computer programmers use the binary system of ones and zeros, this is ever more incoherent. If the notion of zero in this system has a purpose, role, and function, which when arranged in a certain context can produce a particular cybernetic result, then it cannot have the same meaning as quote-unquote pure nothing. Since not only do things which possess a purpose, function, and role have existence, as the status of the possession of those qualities, purpose, function, and role, is proper to that of existence, they are also multiple in their very existence, as having a purpose, function, and multiplicities proper to beings. And that is all they can be proper to, since being is all there is, as isness is being. Furthermore, if in the act of programming the aggregates of ones and zeros has an effect causally speaking, whether per se or per accidents, it nonetheless is something and not nothing, since a pure nothing cannot have an effect on anything. For it to have an effect or be a cause, or to have an effect, a cause must be present. This is an a priori analytic truth. And a cause is something that possesses being, thus a something, and not once again a quote-unquote pure nothing. What we have here is an act of sleight of hand, so to speak, when at once contemporary mathematicians have defined zero to be quote-unquote pure nothing, and they say it also fulfills the role of a placeholder or having causal power in the fields of cybernetic computing systems. In the case of both, it has postulated the meaning of zero to be other than a pure nothing, as the essence of zero postulated in this context fulfills multiple roles such as placeholder, operational use, and computing use. If something has a use and a causal power, then it is something and not a pure nothing, as only things and entities can possess such qualities, as a pure nothing entails the lack of all quantities. Quantities and predication alike, as the act of predication leads to contradiction in this case. Thus, when the programmers speak of zero as that which serves a cybernetic role, he is not speaking of a pure nothing. He is speaking now of some other notion which possesses predication, which, in being predication, is proper to being. Similarly, one may very well ask if zero is a pure nothing, even if it is used as a placeholder in numbers. Then how can numbers terminating with zero, when added to each other, become greater in number, if zero is once again a pure nothing? If you have added nothing to nothing, for example 100 plus 100 equaling 200, how can the zeros in these numbers allow for a numerical increase from 100 to 200? If the zeros lack any numerical value by definition, they can't lead to an increase. Considering also numerical value is needed for increase as well. This is yet another incoherency of contemporary mathematics. All attempts to posit radically different uses of the notion of zero, such as saying zero works differently here, would be to commit the fallacy of special pleading, and also, of course, the law of non-contradiction. It is also not as if they even speak of a different notion of zero either. They mean the same number with the same identity as the notion of pure nothing, which is the root of all further issues. However, with the new notion of zero, which has been posited here in this chapter as a symbol of indefinite decrease, one can say it can still have its use, as the very least as a placeholder, as one can understand a placeholder as something existing as a potency and potentiality, which is of course not a pure nothing. And the reason with this new definition of zero being the symbol of indefinite decrease can be understood as a symbol of potency is because it has a nature of being indefinite, which lacks any numerical determination in the domain of decrease. The indefinite aspect of the symbol is what gives the essence of potency to it in this sense, which is also the essence of a placeholder to be a potency. As in the notion of a placeholder, it is assumed the place being held can be taken or replaced, logically speaking. Now, one can object that I myself am engaging in a form of special pleading when I say that we can use the symbol of indefinite decrease as a form of placeholder potency, even in the case of 100 plus 200, as how can two indefinite decreases equal an increase? This is understandable. However, I am not redefining my notion where it seems fit. I am, however, borrowing an essential aspect of my notion, which is indefinitude, which allows for the termination of placeholding to occur. The symbol of the closed circle is proper to indefinitude, as it is a closed continuity, so it makes perfect sense to use in this context. And if one may like, they can use the indefinite increase as well, which is just two zeros set next to one another, which they're in larger quantities such as 100. However, in the case of 10, it works just as well, as the closed circular nature of 0 is what gives it the essence of infinitude. It is only a number line where we see the use of 0 as a notion proper to decrease indefinitely, as the number line sits in its own special context. This is no case of special pleading here, as we have been consistent with our essential aspect of 0, which is that of potency, proper both in number, which it has as its placeholder, and proper to the number line representing it as a decrease indefinitely, where it does not denote any particular decrease, but rather the potency of decrease itself. Thus, we see a distinction between the numerical 0 and the symbolic 0. Now, one final remark must be made vis-a-vis the numerical zeros functions and operations. When 100 is added to 100 and results in the increase at 200, the zeros in the 100s being potential in order to be moved must be moved by that which is actual, as Aristotle was the first to point out. Only actuality can move things and transform potency into actuality, not the other way around, as actuality is only that which has causal power. In the case of the addition of the two 100s, the zeros are being carried by the ones preceding them, which are determinations, and the potency in the hundreds remains the same, as they have not changed, but the two aspects of actuality once synthesized have thus changed, and that being the one and one in the hundreds becoming now two. In the case of subtraction of the 100s, they should result in 0 now being a pure potency, as actuality in this instance has been negated. All one has left is potency, which is not a pure nothing, but a specific form of being which does not exist as a determined being outside of its own notion. In the case of multiplication, we see the same rules apply. As in the case in that of addition and in the case of division, we can be left with a contemporary or the contemporary undefined. As we divide, that is the mathematical one defined to be exact. We can divide 100 units by a field of potentiality. We are not sure what the result of this is, of this potency, and doesn't allow for certainty. Thus, the addition and subtraction of 0 to itself results in 0, as it is just potency unmoved, as movement requires actuality, and potency is just undetermined being. Language and the predication of quote-unquote nothing. Throughout this chapter, I have used, when describing 0, as the definition of it being a quote-unquote pure nothing, and as well as the word nothing when speaking of 0, which the more astute reader of this text will appear and realize that the use of the word nothing appears to be no different than the use of the symbol 0, as both are giving being to that which is said to be is said to lack the very quality of having being, and thus by all accounts a contradictory notion. Keeping this in mind whilst espousing the ideas hitherto, I have subtly tried to allude to the issue by putting quote-unquote nothing in quotations to denote the notion as invalid itself, and it must be stated that I have throughout the previous parts of this chapter used the term nothing to make the concept more intellectually digestible for the reader. In other words, a less rigorous way of speaking has been used, so in this way the concepts put forward are more accessible to the average person using everyday parlance. That being said, the issue is still present. As Hegel noted, the assertion of the notion of nothing is to give being to nothing, and once considered as a universal notion, it ends up becoming, after having been given the essence of being, none other than the same notion as being, as both are a universality with a notional form, and a form has being, but it is also quote-unquote nothing in this sense, in that no predication can be made of it, as then you are no longer speaking of universal, but rather particular and distinguished ontologies which already presuppose being, but that which with no predicates is no different than nothing, quote-unquote nothing, that is. Even the statement that it has a form is problematic, as it is a predication of it, and thus form itself as a notion is a particular being, so it's inaccurate and not what it is in essence. However, we can understand the form of being without asserting it in its fashion of the quote-unquote notional form of being as such. We can understand being as such as that which exists as a fundamental precondition for all other states of affairs, as all preconditions, state of affairs, etc., presuppose a common being, or rather, that they all exist in the same existence. If they did not, they would not be quote-unquote they, as to be they is to have a being and existence already proper to you. If one were to argue against the existence of existence, then he would negate his own argument, as arguments presuppose existence, irregardless if the arguments are true or false. The very form and act of arguing itself requires that being exists, or if one wants to cite Heidegger here, that Dasein is, as Dasein is present in all affairs spoken of. Thus, much like time was described as being the field of temporal potentiality in previous chapters, that is, and duration the actualization of certain temporally possible qualitative events within the field of time, so can the same be said of being, and that of being itself, as a field which allows for an indefinite amount of possibilities in the particular things which exist in this indefinite field of existential universality, or the actualization of the possibilities that beings as such underlie. All of this is to say that the notion of being is perfectly coherent, unlike that of nothing. But in the case of being, it must be noted that we must engage in a linguistic shift, entailing also an epistemological one, away from the notional form of being to an apophatic understanding of being, as that which underlies all predication, and does so necessarily. It is not only as a concept necessary, but also as a real metaphysical necessity. Nonetheless, the issue of quote-unquote nothing remains, and the solution here is also a linguistic and epistemological shift. Endorsing this, rather than speak of quote-unquote nothing, if one desires to denote negativity in a certain context, speaking the phrase there is not anything is more rigorous, as you are not positing any contradiction of quote-unquote nothing as being, but rather you are speaking of a certain state of affairs in relation to another. The statement, for example, there are not any apples, is absolutely fine, as you're relating a logical possibility to logical actuality. However, when faced with what we normally would invoke, the usage of pure nothing, is better to say, there is not anything outside of being, as to be outside of being is not to be anything, because anything to be anything requires being. The usage of the words not and no are also fine, typically speaking, as they are used to distinguish a certain state of affairs from another. For example, x is not y, and there is no x but x, and no y but y. What is occurring here is relating distinguished ontologies, which is the labor of negativity, that is the act of distinguishing x from y, which in their very essence are not atomized ontologies, as no ontologies can be atomized. Thus, all positive ontologies presuppose an identity distinguished from others, and the participation in distinction is participation in the act of negativity, which is the relational function of being. The cessation of the usage of the term quote-unquote nothing when speaking more accurately about the lack of anything will resolve the confusion and inerrancy of metaphysical understanding, which is seen ultimately in the Hegelian logic of being and nothing, where ultimately they are understood to be one and the same, when it is really one and the same in its flawed notional formal sense, but not in its real metaphysical sense. In the case of the notional form proper to that of the notion of nothing, it is a form which is that of an empty husk with no content to it, and one cannot be spoken of in a presuppositional or transcendental manner. And this is why the notional form, whilst flawed, is not as severe as that of quote-unquote nothing. One can still accept the form of being as very much a real in an apophatic sense or a relational sense, whereas with quote unquote nothing, this cannot occur, as one cannot relate non being to anything, and one cannot accept the form of quote unquote nothing as real because nothing cannot be real by the admission of those who espouse the concept as such. The nominalist dilemma. Throughout this chapter, we have attacked the notion of zero from the perspective of mathematical Platonism, and against those who posit the notion of zero arithmetically irrespective of whether or not the position held was coming forth from a mathematical Platonist or nominalist, since the issue either way is applied to both but not equally. In the case of the nominalist position, that is, the position that all numerical entities are merely symbols of the aggregates of extension, and each distinct number is applied to each distinct aggregate relative to other aggregates of extended quantities, the problem of zero is still very much present. The issue here, from the nominalist perspective, is much more extreme, because if number is just the common pattern of the aggregates of extension or spatial determinations, then when zero is posited as a number while simultaneously meaning a lack of number, we would have, from the nominalist standpoint, an aggregate which is a non-aggregate. In other words, when zero is posited, you are stating that a spatial determination exists, the nominalist notion of number that is, which exists as an extended object since it is concerned with an aggregate, but then it is said to be a complete lack of spatial aggregate at the same time. You once again have a contradiction, and it's more extreme as it would be more immediate as it reveals itself through the senses. Zero, thus, in this nominalist paradigm would lead to a contradictory phenomenological occurrence, such as experiencing something that is not something, and also not a real experience, because if, as nominalism states, number is the mere aggregate of spatial extension, we would be able to observe number as we observe spatial aggregates as subjects. One could then say they observe a determined and extended object while saying they do not experience such a thing, which is a clear contradiction. This here is not to be confused with the experience of illusions, which, as illusions, are not illusory in their identity as an illusion, but only that they appear to be. Rather, this is to point out that if a nominalist was to posit the validity of zero as a number, he would then have to state you can see zero and not see zero, since numbers for the nominalist can be observed. Since all numbers are is the physical patterns we see in space and are a relative set of patterns in comparison to one another. However, zero cannot be a pattern in space because a pattern, aggregate, and space or extension are all things, and zero is not anything. Therefore, the nominalist that posits such a thing leads to a phenomenological contradiction as well as one of logic. Conclusions. Throughout this chapter, we have been able to demonstrate the invalidity of the concept zero and also concepts that follow and tend to accompany the notion of zero, such as that of negative numbers. Similarly, we have also demonstrated that the metaphysical incoherency upon which the notion of zero could have been developed in the first place, namely the notion of quote unquote nothing or quote unquote pure nothing, predicated as a positive ontology. We still understand the usage of these terms and are sympathetic to their usage. However, we do propose a new way of expressing these ideas, more rigorously and logically consistent via the usage of an apophatic predication, not only for the expression for the lack of being, but also for the expression of being as such, as wherein we shall now accept the concept of being as such, but understand that because of reasons mentioned hitherto, it can only be expressed as a necessary precondition of all other beings. And this is presupposed in any act of predication, since all acts of such necessitate being as such anyhow. We also accept a reinterpretation, of course, of zero as a symbol in a twofold manner, one representing numerical potency and the other representing unqualified or undetermined positive numerical decrease. However, the symbol of zero can be used in operations as a number and works well as a placeholder representing potency, the very essence of which is expressed in the twofold manner of zero. In the case of the numerical ontology of zero, it is the potency proper to the essence of qualitative determination. This definition is the same in the case of the usage of zero as a symbol for indefinite decrease. But this, however, in its essence of decrease alone, is only proper in the contextual usage of number lines. The notion of negative numbers can be reinterpreted as well as to mean the movement away from the origin within a number line, but only insofar as this takes place in the context of extension, that is, direction and spatial determinations, and not pure arithmetic.